sometimes, the moments that change our lives forever don't arrive with thunder or applause. They come quietly, in the rain, on an ordinary street where a lonely man in a blue suit sees a child collapse and makes a choice to stay. What began as an unexpected pause in his busy life turned into something he never imagined. A journey of compassion, of promises kept, of discovering that family isn't always the one we are born into, but the one that refuses to let us go. This is not just a story about wealth or power or survival, it is about what happens when a closed heart opens for the first time in years. If you believe in second chances, if you believe in the kind of love that heals even the deepest wounds, then subscribe to Loss and Healing. This is a story you won't want to miss. The rain had a way of making the whole city feel smaller, as if the sky had pressed itself down until every sound was muted and every surface glistened under the steady fall. It came without warning, a curtain of water that turned glass towers into smudges of gray and smeared the headlights of passing taxis into streaks of yellow light. Pedestrians hurried with their umbrellas angled against the wind, collars pulled high, heads bent low, but among the blur of motion, one man sat still. Michael Anderson, a figure in a blue suit that had cost far too much, rested on a weathered wooden bench beneath the half-shelter of a bus stop. His shoes were polished, his cufflinks precise, but his expression hollow. A paper cup of coffee rested in his hand, untouched long after its steam had disappeared. He held it the way someone might hold a photograph, not for use, but because letting go meant admitting there was nothing left to grasp. Michael had not intended to linger here. The meeting that should have commanded his attention, the one etched into every assistant's calendar in red, had been abruptly canceled. Normally, such a disruption would have sent him back to his office, into the glass fortress that insulated him from the messiness of the world. But something about the sudden vacancy in his schedule, combined with the gray persistence of the sky, pulled him into the streets instead. Now here he was, damp shoulders under a suit jacket that shed rain like it was allergic to imperfection, a man of means who looked like he belonged anywhere but on a bus stop bench. He was not watching the city. His eyes drifted across it without focus, as though the shapes and lights were mere illusions behind a pane of glass. Numbers floated in his mind, presentations waiting for approval, mergers lined up like dominoes. These had always been his lifelines, the scaffolding of control and order he depended on. Yet in that moment, they felt distant, like voices muffled through walls. What remained close, what settled heavy in his chest, was exhaustion. Not the kind that a hot shower or another espresso could erase, but a deep tiredness that lived inside his bones. He had become untouchable, and in being untouchable, he had grown numb. And numbness, he knew, was the heaviest burden of all. Then he saw her. At first, just a shape moving through the rain, slight and unsteady, like a candle flame flickering against the storm. She carried a paper bag against her chest as if it were treasure, though the rain had already seeped through, smudging the corners and threatening to tear it apart. Her coat clung to her like wet paper, her shoes slapped against the sidewalk with the weary rhythm of someone long accustomed to discomfort. When she reached the bus stop, she tried to sit, but her strength failed her. She crumpled onto the pavement, the bag splitting open to reveal its modest contents. 2 slices of bread, a bruised apple, a dented thermos. The sight might have passed unnoticed by others indeed. The city continued without pause, taxis hissing through puddles, footsteps rushing by under umbrellas, but for Michael, time stopped. He dropped his coffee and moved instinctively. His knees hit the wet pavement, cold seeping through his trousers, but he did not care. He reached for her hand. It was shockingly small, frighteningly cold, trembling like a leaf caught in the wind. Something pierced his chest then, something old and long buried. The way her fingers tried weakly to curl around his own summoned a memory he had locked away. A night when he too had been small, frightened, clutching the hand of a stranger and hoping desperately for help. The echo of that boyhood moment rippled through him until he felt unsteady, his carefully constructed walls cracking in ways he had never permitted. "Hey, hey," he whispered, his voice rougher than he liked. "You're all right. I've got you." The words trembled as they left him, not because of doubt, but because of the weight of recognition. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wide beneath strands of rain-soaked hair. She managed only a few words, her voice fragile as the drizzle around them. "I have to bring dinner home. Mommy's really sick." The words struck him harder than the rain. for a heartbeat, the city disappeared. The sounds of car horns and rushing feet faded into silence. All that remained was her voice, the plea embedded in those 5 words. She tried to rise, as if duty could lift her frail frame, but he steadied her gently, slipping the apple and thermos back into the bag with care that surprised even himself. Then, without further thought, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of damp clothes and fragile bones, yet the responsibility she carried was heavier than anything he had borne in the boardroom. He called out for his driver, who had been idling nearby in a sleek black car. The driver appeared at once, brows lifting only slightly at the sight of a child pressed against Michael's chest. "Mass General," Michael ordered, his voice sharper now, fueled by urgency. The child did not resist. She nestled against him, her small hand clutching at his collar, as if afraid that letting go meant disappearing. Her breath was shallow, her skin cold against his neck. Michael did not ask her name, not yet. There would be time for questions later, and he feared that pressing too soon might shatter the fragile thread of trust forming between them. The ride to the hospital was consumed by silence. Rain drummed against the car roof, wipers squeaked across the glass, and beneath it all was the faint sound of her breathing against his chest. He held her carefully, one hand on her back, terrified that if he shifted, she might slip away. And in that silence, something stirred inside him. Something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Vulnerability, concern, a flicker of connection. When the car pulled up to the emergency entrance, he stepped out quickly, shielding her from the rain with his own body as he carried her inside. The hospital's fluorescent lights glared down on them, harsh and unfeeling. But the triage nurse who met his eyes did not hesitate. She asked for a name as they transferred the child onto a gurney. Her lips parted, voice faint but clear. "Ava," she whispered before closing her eyes again. Michael stood there, rainwater dripping from his hair, his suit wrinkled, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nurses wheeled her away, and still he remained rooted to the spot, unable to move. He did not know her. He did not know her story. Yet in that single instant, he understood with a clarity that shook him. This moment had changed everything. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the small hospital room, steady and impersonal, like a reminder that life here was measured in beeps and numbers. The sterile air carried a faint sting of antiseptic, mixing with the muffled sounds of voices and hurried footsteps outside. On the bed, beneath a thin blanket, Ava stirred. Her small body curled like a question mark, fragile yet enduring. Her eyelashes fluttered before she opened her eyes, dark and calm, reflecting a strength that seemed far too large for someone so small. Michael sat beside her in a molded plastic chair, his posture rigid yet uncertain, his suit damp and wrinkled from the rain. He had not moved for nearly an hour, his gaze fixed on the slow rise and fall of her chest, as if the sheer force of his attention could keep her breathing steady. His tie lay discarded on a nearby table. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, but he ignored it. For once, the endless demands of his empire meant nothing. All that mattered was the child before him. When her eyes opened fully, he leaned forward slowly, careful not to startle her. "You're awake," he said softly. Ava blinked and whispered, "Yeah." Her voice was dry, almost brittle, but there was clarity in it. "Can I go home now?" Michael frowned. "You fainted on the street. Don't you want to rest a little?" She shook her head with surprising certainty. "My mom needs me." The words caught him off guard. He had expected fear, maybe confusion, maybe even tears. Instead, her urgency was not about herself, but about someone else. That kind of resolve, so adult in its focus, unsettled him. She pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "She doesn't know where I am. She gets worse when she's scared." Michael studied her. Her hair was still damp from the rain, clinging to her pale face. Her lips were cracked, her arms thin beneath the hospital sheet. He tried to steady his voice. "What's your name again?" "Ava," she answered quietly. She pulled the blanket closer around her small shoulders, then added, "And yours is Michael. I heard you say it." He nodded slowly. "That's right." Silence hung between them, the kind that felt heavy with things unsaid. Outside the room, a gurney rattled down the hallway. A baby cried in the distance. But here, the space seemed oddly sacred. Michael leaned forward. You know why you fainted? Ava shrugged, her eyes
Mommy,
fixed on the
she's
window
very
streaked
sick.
with rain.
She coughs a
Didn't
lot
eat
and her
since
skin is
yesterday
red.
morning. The
I don't know
line
what
was
to do.
long. The words landed like a blow. He pressed his lips together. And your mother? She's been sick since Christmas, Ava said, her tone matter of fact. Her chest hurts. She coughs blood. Sleeps most of the time now. She said it with the same flatness someone might use to recite a grocery list. Then she added, almost casually, sometimes the shelter gives us soup. Otherwise, I just get bread. Michael felt his throat tighten. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Ava's voice sharpened with quiet defiance. We're not looking for saving, she said. We just need a little time. The sentence pierced him. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't desperation. It was a declaration of dignity, spoken by a child who had carried too much for too long. Michael stared at her, realizing how much resilience lived in her 7 years' resilience that should have been unnecessary. Resilience carved out of neglect and abandonment. How old are you? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. 7, she said, but I'll be 8 next month. You're very mature for your age.
Yes, I need a
Ava
private
gave a
ambulance.
tiny shrug,
Don't
her
leave me.
expression unreadable, and turned her gaze back to the rain. Do you think she'll be okay? She asked after a pause. Michael wanted to give her reassurance, but the truth lodged like a stone in his chest. He swallowed hard. We'll do everything we can, he said instead, his words steady but his heart unsteady. A nurse entered then, clipboard in hand, her presence brisk but not unkind. She checked Ava's vitals, adjusted the IV, and made
almost
notes
there.
before glancing at Michael.
Mama.
She'll need fluids, but she's stable for now, the nurse said. Then her eyes softened as she looked at Ava. You're lucky someone brought you in. I'm the lucky one, Michael murmured, almost to himself. Ava glanced at him, brows furrowed as if trying to understand. The nurse smiled faintly at Ava. You'll be able to leave soon, sweetheart. Just a little more rest. But Ava's response was immediate.
We have received
Can I
the
go
lab
now?
results.
Her voice carried urgency, not
What
for
did the results say,
herself,
doctor?
but for the mother waiting somewhere in silence.
Good morning.
The nurse
Good morning.
hesitated, then
That will be
smoothed Ava's
5.75,
blanket.
please.
Soon, she said gently before leaving. Michael sat back, his thoughts spinning. He hadn't noticed how tightly his hands were clenched until he caught his reflection in the hospital window. His jaw was tense, his eyes tired, hollowed by years of carefully constructed walls. And in Ava's resilience, in her steady refusal to crumble, he saw a reflection of his younger self, a boy who had once sat beside a sick mother, clutching hope with all the strength his small body could muster.
So the main concern
Memories
is that
he
the
had
procedure will
buried
take several hours.
resurfaced uninvited. Long nights in waiting rooms, hospital bills with red stamps, the sound of his mother's weak breath in the dark. He remembered the absence of a father, the way silence had filled that void,
You want a piece
the
of
way
bread, my dear?
responsibility
Yes,
had
please.
settled
I am
on his
very
small
hungry.
shoulders far too early. He remembered the moment he promised himself he would build a life so controlled, so powerful, that nothing could ever touch him again. And yet here, beside this frail child, those defenses were crumbling. Ava shifted, her eyes heavy but watchful. When can I see my mom? She asked again. Michael exhaled slowly. Soon, he said. Then, almost without realizing it, he added, I'll help you get to her. Her eyes met his, cautious but searching. After a long pause, she gave the smallest nod, as if accepting a promise she wasn't sure she believed yet.
Another one.
Michael
Canceled.
leaned back in the chair, the sound of the rain still tapping softly at the window. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about quarterly numbers, or looming mergers, or boardroom strategies. He was thinking about a little girl named Ava, her quiet strength, her sick mother, and the vow he had just made and spoken, fragile but real. A vow that already carried more weight than anything his wealth had ever bought. The cab ride was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows and the low growl of the engine. Ava sat beside Michael, her small hands folded tightly in her lap, her backpack clutched against her chest like a shield. Her knuckles were raw, the skin chafed from cold and rain, and every so often her fingers twitched rhythmically, the unconscious habit
We
of
will
someone
review the
who had
documents and choose
long
the
lived
plan
in
that suits
tension.
best.
Michael glanced at her from time to time, wanting to ask questions, wanting to reassure her, yet every word he thought of felt inadequate. Silence, for once, seemed the most honest companion. The driver turned down a narrow street where the polished shine of downtown Boston gave way to cracked sidewalks and tired buildings. The cab stopped in front of a two-story structure that had once been a laundromat.
Be okay soon?
Half the sign still clung to the brick, the rest long surrendered to rust and weather. A warped staircase climbed to the apartments above, lit by a single bulb that flickered weakly against the rain. "This is it," Ava said simply. No apology, no hesitation, just fact. Michael paid the driver and followed her up the stairs, each wooden step creaking beneath their weight. The hallway smelled of mildew, bleach, and boiled rice. Ceiling tiles sagged with water stains, and the walls bore the evidence of years of neglect.
Stable.
Ava led the way without
Improving.
slowing, pulling out a tiny
that is
key
my
attached
family.
to a frayed shoelace. She unlocked the third door on the left, and it groaned as it
I
opened.
am here to talk to you
The
about
air
guardianship
inside
of my
was
son.
thick,
I understand
damp,
you are here to
carrying the
discuss your
faint
son's
odor of
guardianship.
sickness hidden
Remember,
beneath
clean
detergent
hands
and
keep us
mold.
safe.
The apartment
Okay,
was a
I will.
single room, smaller than Michael's office bathroom, cluttered but eerily empty of comfort. A dented mini-fridge stood in one corner beside a hot plate. A stack of canned goods, mostly beans, and off-brand Suppressed inside a cracked milk crate. The wallpaper peeled in
This
long
adjustment should
strips,
help reduce
and the lone
possibility of
window
side
was sealed
effects.
with plastic wrap against the winter wind. On a mattress pressed directly to the floor, beneath a heap of mismatched blankets, lay Elena. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged with blue, and her body motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. A cloth had been placed on her forehead, now
what
stiff
you're
and
doing.
dry with age. She did not stir as Ava approached. She was coughing a lot
always protect
yesterday, Ava said, her small voice steady but tired. This morning, she didn't get up. I left a note like I always do, just in case. She pulled the blanket higher over her mother's shoulders, her movements precise, practiced. Michael watched, struck by the quiet discipline of a child who had learned far too early to be caretaker. He stepped closer, the linoleum cold beneath his
Everything
polished
looks perfectly
shoes,
fine.
and crouched beside the mattress. Instinctively, he reached for Elena's wrist, searching for a pulse. It was there faint, but steady. Her breathing was shallow, strained, the kind that revealed years of neglect and absence of care.
Progress is
She
slow,
used to be
but we are
strong,
hopeful.
Ava said
We
softly,
are hopeful.
holding up a worn badge. The name Elena Brooks was printed beneath a faded photograph. She worked at the clinic, helped people. But when she got sick and couldn't work, no one helped her back. Michael's chest tightened. He looked around the room again, no medicine bottles,
for me.
no doctor's
see
instructions, no signs of recent care. Only survival, scraped together from whatever scraps Ava could manage. His gaze fell on a small tin box Ava had pulled from beneath a towel. She opened it with reverence. Inside were a handful of crumpled dollar bills, a few coins, a bus pass, and a folded note in uneven handwriting. "Dear Mommy, if you wake up and I'm not here, don't be scared. I went to get dinner.
Please
I
don't
love
leave
you
me alone
always, Ava." Michael swallowed hard, the words blurring before his eyes. He realized with sudden clarity, if nothing changed, Elena would not survive much longer.
It is
"This
a good
isn't
sign.
safe," he
The
said
monitors
under his
are
breath,
steady.
more to himself than to her. "We don't have anywhere else," Ava replied, her voice calm in its resignation. "You do now." His words were firm, sharper than he intended. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance, not the city hospital, a private facility.
Come back.
She needs real care."
Come back.
Ava hesitated, her hand
We are
tightening
waiting.
around her mother's. "Will they let me go with her?" Michael met her gaze directly. "You're not leaving her, I promise." That word promise felt heavy on his tongue, foreign after years of avoiding commitments that could not be calculated or controlled. But as soon as he said it, he meant it. The call was quick. Within 20 minutes, 2 paramedics arrived. The apartment felt even smaller as they carried in their equipment.
Here are the
Ava
documents.
never let go of her mother's hand as they lifted her
Oh,
carefully
no.
onto a stretcher. "It's okay now, Mommy,"
It is
she
going to be
whispered,
all right.
her voice trembling for the first
hope so.
time. "We're going someplace better." Michael carried Ava's backpack in one hand, his other hand resting gently on her back as they followed the stretcher down the narrow staircase.
more time.
Outside,
This
the
is
wind
simply
cut
not
colder,
acceptable.
but Ava leaned toward her mother, her whole body bent toward the
primary
fragile
issue
hope
here
of
is the
staying
patient's consent
close.
Exactly.
In the
It states
ambulance,
here.
Michael sat beside her, ignoring the puzzled glances of the EMTs. He had never ridden in the back of an emergency vehicle before, never imagined his world would bring him here. Yet now, as the siren wailed and the city blurred past, he felt more present than he had in years. He looked at Ava, her small fingers gripping
And
the edge
can
of
you
the
tell me a
stretcher,
little bit about
her
what's
eyes
happening in your
fixed on her
picture?
mother's pale face. And he realized that in saving them, something in him was being saved
Wow.
too. The hospital days unfolded in a rhythm that blurred night and day into one continuous stretch of waiting. Michael had thought his life was governed by schedules, precise blocks of time divided by meetings, contracts, and deadlines. But here, in the pediatric wing of a Boston hospital, time bent differently. Hours stretched around breaths, around the quiet beep of monitors, around the slow rhythm of a child's voice filling silence. Ava became his anchor. Each morning, he arrived with 2 cups of cocoa and a small paper bag from a local bakery. The woman at the counter, a kind-faced cashier with silver curls, began to recognize him and always tucked in an extra muffin for the little artist. Michael never corrected her. By the time he reached the hospital's family floor, Ava was often awake, sitting cross-legged on a small cot with her sketchbook open and her crayons arranged in neat lines. Her smile was not large, but it grew steadier each day. She would hand him a drawing sometimes of flowers in the hospital garden, sometimes of her mother, surrounded by colors Ava wished into being. He always accepted them as if they were priceless artifacts. When he slipped one into the pocket of his suit, her eyes shone with quiet pride. Elena's condition remained fragile, but the tide had shifted. Her vitals, once precarious, grew stronger. The hollowness in her cheeks softened, color returning faintly, as if hope itself painted her back into existence. Nurses no longer whispered in cautious tones. Instead, they spoke of progress, of slow healing. Michael found himself drawn into the details of her care. He read every chart, asked every question, followed up with Dr. Patel, the attending physician. He wasn't acting like a CEO demanding answers, but like someone who could not bear to leave anything to chance.
I promise you.
He had postponed meetings, ignored endless calls, and allowed his assistant's confusion to pile up in unanswered messages. None of that mattered. What mattered was here. Meals became shared moments. Michael would sit with Ava in the cafeteria or on the family floor, asking her about her sketches, about the meals she used to make with her mother, about the songs she remembered her singing. Ava told him fragment shelf stories pieced together by memory. She used to hum while folding clothes. When I was sick, she put cold spoons on my wrists. One Christmas, she taped green paper to the wall and drew ornaments. Michael listened intently, not out of politeness, but because those fragments mattered. They were proof of the world Ava longed to protect. They were proof that Elena was not just a patient in a bed, but a mother who had fought for her child until her body gave out. At night, after Ava had fallen asleep curled beside the hospital bed, Michael sometimes sat in silence near Elena. The steady beep of monitors filled the room, but his mind wandered back to his own past. He found himself speaking softly to her, as if confiding secrets to someone who might not hear but would understand. He told her about his mother, about the long nights waiting for test results, about the way poverty and illness had shaped his drive. She reminds me of her, he admitted one evening, glancing at Ava. Strong, quiet, carrying too much without asking for anything. That night, Elena's fingers twitched. The nurse insisted it might be involuntary, but Michael believed otherwise. On the 5th day, they were allowed into the small hospital garden. It wasn't much, just a few flower beds and a chipped fountain, but to Ava, it was paradise. She ran between the tulips, laughter ringing like music, gathering dandelions to make wishes. Michael sat on a bench, watching her move freely under the pale spring sun. When she returned, she handed him a new drawing without a word. It showed 3 figures beneath a bright yellow sun: a woman with long hair, a little girl with pigtails, and a man in a blue suit holding a balloon. Inside the balloon was a crooked heart. Michael felt something shift inside him. "Is that me again?" he asked gently. Ava nodded. "I made your suit blue this time. Blue feels kinder." He folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his blazer, right over his heart. That night, he whispered to Elena while holding her still hand, "I don't know what this is, but I don't want to leave, not this time." He fell asleep in the chair, head leaning back against the wall. Just before dawn, he stirred at the faintest sound of breath taken with more strength, a shift of fabric. Elena's lips moved. Her head turned slightly toward Ava's soft breathing on the cot. Michael stood, heart pounding. "Elena?" he whispered. Her fingers curled, unmistakably this time around the edge of the blanket. A nurse entered and smiled. "It's a sign," she said softly. "She's coming back."
Congratulations to you both.
Michael turned toward the window where the sunrise painted the room in pale orange light. He looked back at Ava, still asleep with her hair spilling across her face. Then he whispered to Elena, Come back. We're waiting. The day Elena whispered her daughter's name, the atmosphere inside the hospital shifted. What had been cautious hope became tangible, a thread of possibility that pulled everyone closer. Ava clung to her mother's hand, tears streaking her cheeks, while Michael stood just behind them, feeling as though something inside his chest had finally cracked open. But hope has a way of drawing shadows. That same evening, while Ava dozed against her mother's side, a nurse delivered an envelope addressed to Miss Elena Brooks. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper heavy and official. Michael opened it carefully, and the words inside tightened his stomach. A petition for custody filed by Jacob Brooks, the man who had abandoned them years before. The timing was cruel, arriving just as Elena was regaining strength. Phrases like parental incapacitation and restoration of rights leapt off the page like accusations. When Michael returned to the room, Elena's eyes were open, following his movements. She saw the envelope in his hand, and without words, she understood. Her voice was faint but certain. He's trying to take her. I don't have the strength to fight alone. Michael sat beside her and took her hand firmly. You're not alone. Not anymore. The vow hung heavy in the sterile air, more binding than any contract he had ever signed. The week that followed became a blur of preparation. Michael was no stranger to strategy, but this was no corporate negotiation. This was about Ava. He stayed up late with lawyers, sifting through custody filings, collecting statements from doctors and hospital staff. Elena, still too weak to attend hearings, wrote a sworn affidavit recounting years of abandonment, the slow unraveling of her health, and the resilience of her daughter. She ended it with a single line. Michael didn't replace anyone. He simply became someone we could count on. Ava was called into a quiet room to meet with a child counselor. There were soft rugs, warm lamps, and baskets of toys. But Ava didn't play. She sat with her sketch pad, crayons lined up like tools. When asked who made her feel safe, she pointed to her drawing. Her mother in a bed, herself standing nearby, and a tall man in a blue suit with a heart on his chest. That's my safe person, she said simply. He's the one who didn't leave.
I will not
On the
fail.
morning of the hearing, Michael stood outside the courthouse, its brick facade weathered and unremarkable. Yet to him, it felt like the center of the world. Everything had led to this. One room, one judge, one decision that would define Ava's future. Inside, Jacob Brooks sat at the front with his lawyer. His suit was ill-fitting, his expression carefully polished, his words rehearsed. He spoke of recovery, of newfound commitment, of second chances. He claimed he wanted to step back into the role of fatherhood, to make amends for his absence. But when asked about Ava's birthday, her school, her favorite foods, his answers stumbled. He didn't know. His silence spoke louder than his claims. When it was Michael's turn, he did not bring theatrics. He stood tall, straightening his sleeves, and spoke plainly. I didn't come into Ava's life because I had to, he said, his voice steady. I came because she needed someone, and I stayed because I realized I needed her just as much. I'm not here for a title or a role I haven't earned. I'm here because she asked for one thing that I not walk away. And I promised I wouldn't. The courtroom grew still. His words were not grand, but they carried weight. Finally, the judge turned to Ava, seated beside a guardian near the back. Where do you want to live? The judge asked gently. Ava looked first at her mother, frail but present in a wheelchair. Then she turned to Michael. Her voice was quiet but unwavering, with the people who didn't leave. The silence that followed was profound. The judge leaned back, pen poised, then signed the order. Joint guardianship was awarded to Michael Anderson for the duration of Elena's recovery. Custodial rights for Jacob Brooks were suspended pending further evaluation. The decision was final, though it arrived without drama, just the quiet certainty of justice rendered. Elena let out a sob of relief, her frail hand trembling in Michael's. Ava pressed herself against him, wrapping her arms around him not as a stranger, but as someone she trusted entirely. Is it over now? She asked. Michael knelt so his eyes met hers. No, he said softly. It's just beginning. But the worst part is behind us. That evening, back at the hospital, Elena rested safely in her room. Ava curled beside her, her small frame relaxed for the first time in weeks. Michael sat by the window, watching dusk settle over the city. He had signed contracts worth millions, had stood in boardrooms filled with power and ambition. Yet none of it compared to this, the simple weight of a promise kept, the fragile beauty of a family being rebuilt. And as night fell, he realized something he had never admitted before. He was no longer an outsider orbiting around other people's lives. He was inside, part of something real, bound not by blood or obligation, but by the choice to stay. The new apartment was bathed in golden morning light, a stark contrast to the cramped, dim room they had left behind. Sunlight poured through freshly cleaned windows, warming the hardwood floors. The walls, painted in soft cream, were already decorated with Ava's drawings flowers with smiling faces, stick figures holding hands, a rainbow above a small house with 3 hearts floating over the roof. The air smelled of cinnamon toast and fresh coffee. But beneath those scents was something richer, something Michael had not felt in years: belonging. Michael stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, buttering toast while oatmeal simmered gently on the stove. This was not the life he was used to. No boardrooms, no sharp suits, no walls of glass between him and the world. Yet here, in the simple act of preparing breakfast, he felt more grounded than he had in decades. At the table, Elena sat in a cardigan and slippers. Her face was still thinner than it once had been, her body still fragile from illness, but there was color in her cheeks now, and strength had begun to return to her voice. Recovery would take time, but she was healing not just in body, but in spirit, knowing she no longer had to fight alone. Beside her sat Ava, barefoot, legs swinging freely under the table as she sprinkled strawberries into 3 bowls of oatmeal. She hummed an off-key tune, light and unself-conscious, filling the apartment with life. "Breakfast is ready," Michael announced, setting the bowls down. They gathered at the table. It was such a small thing, 3 people eating together, yet it felt sacred. They didn't pray, but the silence before they lifted their spoons carried the reverence of gratitude. Ava broke it first, grinning with her mouth full. "This is way better than hospital toast," Michael chuckled. "That's a low bar." "But it's our toast now," she said, her eyes bright. They ate slowly, savoring more than just the food. At one point, Ava reached across the table, taking her mother's hand in one of hers and stretching the other toward Michael. Their 3 hands rested together, one large, one gentle, one small, forming a chain that felt unshakable. Michael looked down and felt a deep shift within him. He was not circling their world anymore. He was inside it. After breakfast, they unpacked the last of the boxes. Michael had gone out of his way to make sure the apartment wasn't just a temporary shelter, but a home. Ava's room glowed with color shelves for books, a desk by the window, her name painted above the bed in bright letters. Elena's room held a soft reading chair by the window, a small bookshelf stocked with novels, and fresh linens that smelled of lavender. In the living room, between framed photos, Michael had placed a simple drawing, the first Ava had ever given him, the one of 3 figures under a yellow sun, the man in a blue suit holding a balloon with a heart inside. It sat at the center of the wall, a quiet testament to where their journey began. That evening, they walked together in the park. The same park where, weeks earlier, Michael had sat alone in the rain, convinced his life was made of nothing but glass and steel. Now, the skies were streaked with lavender and orange, and Ava ran ahead, arms outstretched like wings. Her laughter rose above the hum of the city, unrestrained and bright. "You're walking too slow," she called from a bench, climbing onto it and spinning in a circle. Michael and Elena strolled behind her, their pace unhurried. Elena's arm brushed against his as they walked. Neither spoke at first, but when their fingers touched, tentative and unsure, they didn't pull away. Instead, their hands intertwined, firm and steady. Elena glanced up at him, her smile soft but certain. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. Michael looked back at her, his gaze steady. "But I did, and I always will." They walked in silence after that, their joined hands swaying between them like a promise made real. Later, back at the apartment, Ava sat on the living room floor with her crayons, sketching a new picture while Michael brewed tea. Elena leaned against the doorway, watching them with a hand pressed to her chest, as if holding something too fragile to release into words. "Do you think," she asked softly, "we'll always be like this?" Michael looked up from the kettle. His voice was calm, sure. "No," he said. She blinked, surprised. Then he added, "I think we'll be better." Ava jumped up, holding out her latest drawing proudly. This one showed 3 hands sewn large, one gentle, one smalling together in the shape of a heart. "This one's for the fridge," she declared. Michael took it, studying the simple yet profound image. "Then it goes in the center," he said with a smile. That night, the three of them sat together on the couch under a shared blanket, a candle flickering on the table before them. The city outside hummed with life, but inside the apartment there was a deeper stillness. Not the emptiness of loneliness, but the fullness of belonging. They didn't need words. The silence itself was enough. For the first time in his life, Michael realized he was not standing outside looking in. He was home. Sometimes the stories that touch us most are not about grand victories or extraordinary heroes. They are about quiet promises, about the strength to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. Michael had built an empire on control, on numbers, on power, but none of it ever gave him what he found in a rain-soaked evening at a bus stop. A fragile hand reaching for his, a child who simply needed someone who would not let go. Ava never asked for riches, never asked for miracles. She only asked for time, for someone to stand beside her when the world kept turning away. And in choosing to hold on, Michael discovered a truth he had spent his whole life running from, that love is not measured by contracts or wealth, but by presence, by who shows up when everything falls apart, by who stays. Elena's healing was slow, but her recovery was more than physical.
We need to talk.
It was proof that no one, no matter how forgotten, is beyond hope when someone chooses to see them, to lift them, to believe in them. Together, the three of them built something more lasting than Michael's towers of glass and steel. They built a home not bound by blood, but by trust, by kindness, by the refusal to abandon one another. This story reminds us that family can appear in the most unexpected places: in a rainy sidewalk, in a hospital waiting room, in the simple act of breakfast shared around a small kitchen table. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not loud or dazzling. Sometimes they are as quiet as a child's hand slipping into yours, or as steady as the promise whispered, "I'll stay." If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that compassion can change the course of a life, that healing often begins with one choice to care, then we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Loss and Healing, where every story is a reminder that even in the darkest storms, light can break through, and even in the loneliest hearts, love can return. Because the world does not need more people who walk away. It needs more who choose to stay. And maybe, in hearing these stories, you will find the courage to stay too.